Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for coming.
Good afternoon.
I'm going to be giving a talk titled Loyalists and the Birth of Libraries in New England, the marriage of Martin and Abigail Howard. And I'm going to start out with some introductions. This is Martin Howard. He was born approximately around 1715 in or near Newport, Rhode Island. And he was a Loyalist, which affected his entire life in many different ways. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of Abigail. I wish I knew what she looked like. What I have here instead is a drawing of the Boston Common in 1768, because that's a site that Abigail would have been familiar with. And she was born in 1743. She was Martin Howard's second wife, and she was one of the daughters of Stephen Greenleaf, who was the last royally appointed sheriff in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. And I'm going to be using that last royally appointed phrase quite a bit because I am talking about Loyalists. And their marriage is one that I've been interested in for a long time. Martin Howard is the figure at the center of my current book project. And I have known for a very long time that he was involved with the founding of the Redwood Library in Newport, Rhode Island. It was founded in 1747, and it was, as was common of libraries of that period, a subscription library. It worked a little bit like a Netflix subscription. You had to pay a certain amount each month in exchange for being able to check out books. And I have known that about Martin Howard for as long as I have known about Martin Howard. However, in my recent research, I realized that Abigail, at the end of her life, had been one of the founders of the Boston Library Society. And that was something that I found fascinating about these two people who, of course, held together by their political interests. They both suffer a great deal of hardship for their loyalty to the British Crown and Parliament, but they also clearly are a couple who were held together by a love of books. And so I'm going to be examining the full span of their lives, which covers both sides of the Atlantic world, their position as colonists loyal to the British Empire, and that shared commitment to New England libraries. Though since Martin's involvement with the Redwood Library was near the beginning of his life, and Abigail's involvement with the Boston Library Society is near the end of her life, the discussions of libraries will serve as literal and figurative bookends of this overall talk. So, Martin Howard, as I mentioned, was born sometime around 1715 in Newport, Rhode Island. He studied law with an attorney in Newport named James Honeyman Jr. And he married his first wife, Anne Brenton Conklin, on December 29th, 1749. And the Howard family, as far as anyone can tell, was a comfortable family, but not a particularly wealthy or well-connected family. In marrying Anne Brenton Conklin, Martin Howard makes this massive leap up the social library. She'd been born Anne Brenton. The Brentons are some of the older families to settle in Rhode Island. I'm going to be talking more about some of her other family later on. She had first been married to a wealthy merchant named James Conklin. He dies, and so she marries Martin Howard December 29th, 1749. And they have a daughter, christened Anne, but always referred to as Annie, who was christened on August 24th, 1754, at Trinity Church in Newport, Rhode Island. And this is a church that clearly was extremely important to Annie Howard. So this gets them started. They are a prosperous young couple in the town of Newport, which at this time is the capital of the colony of Rhode Island. They purchased a home. They spent a lot of time investing in it. They may have done some expansions on it. And conveniently, I'll come back to this in a minute, conveniently, this house is literally around the corner from the Colony House in Newport. This is the Colony House, which is where everything that is important in Rhode Island at this period happens. This is where the government meets. This is often where the court meets. And if you look off here in the corner, there's the Howard House. So, perfect location for an up-and-coming young man who is an attorney who represents the colony of Rhode Island at the Albany Congress in 1754, who has all kinds of different positions in Newport. And it seems like everything's going great. Sadly, Anne will die in 1764. Now, to say that somebody is friends with Benjamin Franklin in the 18th century really does not say anything, because Benjamin Franklin, of course, is friends with everybody. But Martin Howard was also friends with Benjamin Franklin. And he writes this letter, which closes, "I've lost a valuable and affectionate wife. She's gone to that undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. She died about 7 weeks ago. This is a very affecting circumstance to me, and therefore my mentioning of it, naturally enough, accounted for." So you have a sense from this letter that this was a marriage that was made for practical reasons. It's a nudge up the ladder, but you also have the sense that this was a marriage of two people who were also in love with each other. And his life, however, continues. As I mentioned, he's very active in Newport. And his other big project in these years is his involvement with the Redwood Library. This is from the original architectural drawing. This is one of the first neoclassical buildings to be constructed in British North America. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is a subscription library. You have to pay a certain amount of money each month, but in exchange, you can come and borrow books. This is a photograph of the inside 18th century part of the Redwood Library. And the thing that brought the Redwood Library into existence in 1747 was the donation of a collection of about 750 books from Abraham Redwood, who is a major player in Rhode Island. He's a wealthy plantation owner, both in Rhode Island and also down in the Caribbean, and he puts up the funds to purchase 750 books. They're shipped over from London, and then other subscribers in town put up the money to construct the building. And this is a page from the first list of all of the books in the collection. Gradually over time, this is going to be expanded. And one of the things we know about Martin Howard is that he served as the librarian for the Redwood in the early 1750s, which meant he was responsible for keeping track. How do you making sure if somebody checks out a book that they bring it back to you. This is also something that Benjamin Franklin struggled with, since he sets up a similar library down in Philadelphia. I'm wondering if that's some of the friendship between them. What they eventually come up with is this rule that if you do not bring your book back, then you are barred from ever checking books out again, ever. And since books are hard to come by, this seems to have been fairly effective. And then Martin Howard, circa 1764, starts getting involved in a new set of political activities. 1764, if you're familiar with the American Revolution, is the point where things start to get real. And he and a group of his friends, whom they called themselves the Newport Junto, are publishing endless letters to the editor of the Newport Mercury, arguing in favor of supporting the taxes, arguing in favor of Rhode Island becoming a crown colony rather than a chartered colony. Rhode Island is one of the last of the chartered colonies. They argued in favor of home textile production, and most importantly, they argue in favor of the stamp tax. And this is a pamphlet titled A Letter from a Gentleman at Halifax to his friend in Rhode Island, which Martin Howard publishes in 1765. Now, the title would immediately have been evident to a reader in the mid-18th century. Halifax, Nova Scotia is the seat of the British Army and Navy. So if you say you're a gentleman at Halifax, it's code for this is going to be pro-Parliament. And this particular pamphlet was printed on this press, the Samuel Hall Press, which is owned by the Newport Historical Society, who also owned the Colony House and Martin Howard's house as well. And Samuel Hall is an interesting figure unto himself. If you're at all familiar with newspapers of this period, they tend to be highly partisan. You're either a pro-patriot paper or a pro-loyalist paper. Samuel Hall does his best in 1764 and 1765 to be I'm going to publish both perspectives. However, he gets called in and asked to answer for this. Why are you publishing all those loyalists? The loyalists in question then published a letter to the editor in the Newport Mercury saying, this is like the Star Chamber. And if ever there is something to not say to a group of New Englanders, it's you are acting like Parliament during the English Revolution. Samuel Hall is eventually told that he can stop publishing all of that, or he can have bad things happen to him. It's a little unclear what he said, and in any event, the situation will rapidly get out of Samuel Hall's hands because the Stamp Act riots happen here in Boston, and then 9 weeks later, Martin Howard publishes a letter to the editor, once again to Samuel Hall, in the Newport Mercury on August 26th, 1765, which informed his neighbors, I do not retract any position contained in the Halifax letter. And if his person, because he's referring to himself as the gentleman from Halifax, and interest become the objects of popular revenge for these sentiments, he thinks he shall never lament the cause, whatever the consequences. And then he goes on to criticize them, saying, look, we're English, I thought you people believed in freedom of speech. And as you can imagine, this is basically like setting a match to a haystack during a drought. Martin Howard gets word that it's not going well in Newport on that night. So he makes a decision. He's pretty much his 10-year-old daughter Annie's only living relative because Martin Howard's parents are dead at this time, Anne's parents are dead at this time, Martin was an only child. If anything happens to him, she's going to be in serious trouble. So he arranges for the two of them to go and shelter on the HMS Signet in Newport Harbor. Nothing is recorded of what 10-year-old Annie thought as they're being rowed out into the harbor, running for their lives, but I really wish I knew what Annie thought. And it turns out it was a good idea that they got themselves safely out to the Signet because that night, Martin and two other members of the Newport Junto, all three of them were going to be stamp tax collectors, are hanged in effigy on the Newport Common, and then they go and try and attack Martin Howard's house. And this is a punch bowl which the Newport Historical Society found the fragments of in the backyard. They then had it glued back together, but it dates to about this period. So their theory is that this is something that belonged to the Howards. It got tossed out a window that night, it broke, and then sat in the backyard for a couple hundred years. So Martin and Annie Howard make a sensible decision. We're going to London. And they will travel there late in the summer of 1765. And he will then testify before Parliament about the Stamp Act riots and the overall Stamp Act crisis, and his testimony is described as having been given to, quote, with knowledge and without passion or prejudice. And to thank him for his services to a grateful nation, Charles Lennox, who's the third Duke of Richmond, and just for anybody who's a fan of the PBS miniseries Aristocrats, if that name is sounding kind of familiar, Charles Lennox is Caroline and Emily and Louisa and Sarah and Celia's brother. And since I was a big fan of that series when it came out, I think about 2 decades ago now, when I realized that, I was really excited, because this means that that group of women, who I find very interesting, almost certainly knew about Martin. So, Charles Lennox, Duke of Richmond, third Duke of Richmond, recommends that Martin Howard be made the Chief Justice of North Carolina. This is a major promotion. This is as high as you can rise as a member of the legal profession in the British North American colonies. Okay, fine, the reason why North Carolina needs a new Chief Justice is because the last one just committed suicide, but we don't know anything about why that happened. Still, this is a big deal. And he and Annie travel to North Carolina, spend about 2 months there, and then come back up to New England, headed for Boston. There's actually a letter from Governor William Tryon of North Carolina basically saying, you just got here. Why are you leaving? You're my Chief Justice. Well, the reason why they were headed up to Boston is because Martin was getting married for a second time. At some point in that late summer of 1767, he poses for that portrait with John Singleton Copley of him in his justice's robes. His new wife, as I mentioned earlier, is Abigail Greenleaf, who is the daughter of Stephen Greenleaf, the last royally appointed sheriff in Suffolk County. How the two of them met, we don't know. I am theorizing this is Loyalist connections upon Loyalist connections upon Loyalist connections. I do have to wonder, given that Martin and Annie flee in the summer of 1765, and he's back to marry Abigail in the summer of 1767, was the courtship getting underway before the Stamp Act crisis? Now, as I've mentioned, things are getting a little tense if you were a Loyalist. And so the marriage does not happen in Boston. The marriage happens at the home of John Wentworth, who's the last royally appointed governor of New Hampshire. And this is his house, which still stands today. So this is the house where Martin Howard and Abigail Greenleaf were married on August 26th, 1767. This is the same day as that letter to the editor he'd published in the Newport Mercury. I have wondered, was that deliberate? Was that not? Who knows? It's also my wedding anniversary, just for good measure. All right, so he has his new bride, and it's back to North Carolina. Here's a map of North Carolina of this period. Down here in the southeastern corner, you'll see New Bern. New Bern in the mid-1760s was the capital of North Carolina. North Carolina goes through a lot of capitals. The capital used to be Wilmington down here, but during the Stamp Act crisis, Governor Tryon got a little tired of colonists rioting outside his house and announced that he was moving the capital to New Bern, and you all can just move with me. So they head for New Bern. And New Bern and Newport, Rhode Island are actually very similar communities, which is something I was struck by when I visited New Bern for the first time in 2015. They are relatively small communities that at one time were the capital of their colony, but are not the capital of the 21st century state. They are port towns that are surrounded by farmland and marshes. This is the house that they owned in New Bern, and it, conveniently, was a couple blocks away from what was colloquially known in North Carolina as this period as Tryon's Palace. Because part of Tryon, I'm moving the government to New Bern, was, you're going to build me this fancy new house, which will not only be the house for me, it will also be where we host all the legislature and courts and things like that. This is not the original one. That burned down after the American Revolution. This is a reproduction that was built in the mid-20th century. And as part of their new life in New Bern, the Howards also acquired a plantation. Very little is known about this plantation. This is one of the problems with people who have to run for their lives a lot. And I knew from his writings that they'd owned it, and I knew it was at the mouth of the Neuse River, and some of the archivists in the North Carolina State Archives, who, by the way, are some of the best archives in the world, helped me use maps of the 18th century to try and track down where this site of the plantation was. And this is approximately where it was, and there's nothing left there now. I don't know when it was destroyed, probably during the Revolution, but it is a glorious, beautiful spot. All right, so we have a man who is settling into North Carolina, and we know bits and pieces about his life in North Carolina. One of the best sources is a letter written by a man named John Whiting to Ezra Stiles. Ezra Stiles is one of the better-known New Englanders of the 18th century. He was the Congregationalist minister in Newport, Rhode Island. He will go on to be a president of Yale. One of the Yale colleges is named for him. And John Whiting, Newport resident, writes a letter to Ezra Stiles in 1767 to talk about how he's met Martin. And when I first came across that letter, I thought, okay, who is John Whiting? Why does this letter exist? Well, it turned out that John Whiting's daughter had married a colonist from North Carolina named Harding Jones. And the young couple had then moved back to North Carolina for Harding, to North Carolina for her. Okay, that's fine. Then I did a little more digging. How did they meet? Well, Harding Jones went to Yale, studied with Ezra Stiles. He did the marriage ceremony. So, Ezra Stiles, matchmaker. And so John Whiting is now down in New Bern visiting his daughter. And he has had tea with Howard and adds, "My Lord Chief Justice is very alert, in high spirits, and extremely complacent, and polite, and greatly improved, and refined." And he seems to have been reflecting on what has perhaps changed here. Because he then goes on to add, "Whether the change is to be ascribed to the European air or American fire, I don't pretend to determine. But think it is allowed that the latter is the great refiner. Perhaps the Sons of Liberty may claim some acknowledgement for his present honorary and lucrative situation with which they have regaled him." We have no records from the Newport Sons of Liberty of what they thought about having basically helped their worst enemy into this position. But the Newport Sons of Liberty do not have too much to worry about, because if you're thinking about the advance of time, you know that time is running out for the Howards for a second time. 1775 is a big year here in Massachusetts. It's almost as big a year down in North Carolina. And on May 31st, 1775, a group of North Carolina residents draw up something called the Mecklenburg Resolves, which said, "All laws and commissions confirmed by or derived from royal authority were no longer valid." In short, Martin Howard is out of a job. Josiah Martin, the last royally appointed governor of North Carolina, runs for his life. Now, here we get a variation in this story. Martin Howard is given permission to resign his position as the Chief Justice, sell the house in New Bern, move to Richmond Plantation, and live there basically under house arrest with his family. One of the really interesting things about Martin Howard in North Carolina is North Carolinians really liked him. And that's something I've spent a lot of time in my bigger picture research looking into why that was the case. But still, that was a very generous offer. You can stay. We'll let you keep most of your property. We're not taking the house in New Bern. You can sell it. And my theory on why this comes about, beyond the fact that on the whole he was better liked in North Carolina than Rhode Island, one of Martin Howard's closest friends in North Carolina was a man named James Ardell. James Ardell will go on to be one of the first justices of the United States Supreme Court. Ardell's brother-in-law was Samuel Johnson, who's the first governor of the state of North Carolina. And my guess is that James Ardell and Johnson advocated for the Howards. This, by the way, is a picture of James Ardell's home in Edenton, North Carolina. We know that the Howards periodically stayed there with him. Late in the summer of 1777, Martin Howard sends James Ardell a letter. I wish you could come to visit us at Richmond. There you will see what I think the best piece of meadow in Carolina, whence, when I leave this country, you might be able to add to the few observations which may be made upon an unimportant character, that I had made 2 blades of grass grow where only one grew before, a circumstance among some nations of no small honor and renown. This letter is one that I first read in the summer of 2005, and this letter is the reason why I decided that Martin Howard was somebody I needed to know more about. That it was just so beautifully written, and there's also a certain amount of heartbreak. He knows he's running out of time. In 1777, he's given a choice. You can become a patriot, sign all the oaths in the world saying that you no longer support the king, or you can leave. And there's a mass exodus out of North Carolina of Loyalists. He and Abigail and Annie join that. They go up to New York. They spend some time there. They then travel to London, and they live in Chelsea for a couple of years. And we know virtually nothing about this time period in their lives. We know that Martin had a £250 a year pension from the British government. We also know that pension ended at his death. He dies in 1781. Abigail Greenleaf Howard, and again, we know very little about the thought process here. Abigail Greenleaf Howard still has family in Boston. Her father was a Loyalist, but there are other members of the Greenleaf family who were patriots. The Greenleafs have actually been allowed to do the, okay, stay here, keep your mouth shut, because they have the patriot family members. And Abigail and Annie come back to Boston in 1783. And 4 years after that, Annie Howard will get married. And I mentioned that earlier that her mother's family, the Brentons, are one of the best connected families in Rhode Island. Well, Annie Howard's new spouse, Andrew Spooner, is a relation by marriage. Her great aunt was the first wife of one of his maternal grandfather. It took me a while to draw out that genealogy chart. So there's not a blood relation, but there's definitely a family relation. Connected with these relations is Andrew Spooner's family, which is basically a who's who of New England Loyalists. His grandfather was Andrew Oliver, who is the stamp tax master in Boston. His great uncle was the last royally appointed governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson. So Annie Howard marrying Andrew Spooner is major Loyalist families forming and reforming. And they were married at Trinity Church in Newport. And I've been working on an article for the Newport History Journal about the Howards, and at the time, I didn't know about the fact that I knew about Andrew Oliver and Thomas Hutchinson being his family. I had not realized at that time that the Hutchinson, although I should have thought of that because Hutchinson, of course, is a Rhode Island family. Because I'd sent off the latest draft to the editor at the Newport History Journal, who wrote back and said, I'm not saying Annie Howard did not get married at Trinity Church in Newport, because obviously she did. We've got the record. You got any thoughts on why? And I thought, well, let's start looking into the Brentons, which is when I realized that the Brentons were connected by marriage to the Olivers and the Hutchinsons. And so it makes sense that the two of them were married in Newport because they both come from Rhode Island families. They then have two children, Anna Howard Spooner and Andrew Spooner. Not a lot of original names in this family. And they're christened here in Boston at Trinity Church. Annie Howard is, like her stepmother-in-law, like her mother, a fascinating woman we know virtually nothing about. She lost her mother when she was 10. She then dies when Anna is 4 and Andrew is 2. And I cannot imagine what is running through the mind of a woman who knows what it is to grow up without a mother, and her poor kids are even younger than she was at the time. We also have some evidence that Abigail Howard was concerned about this and was very aware of this situation. Because when Abigail Howard dies in 1801, her will, and I'll come back to her will later on, notes, I have left $500 to her own use, also a diamond ring, which was her mother's, to Mrs. Hannah Bulfinch, wife of Mr. Charles Bulfinch. In 1841, Charles Bulfinch writes to his sons, "It is now 3 weeks since the sudden, unexpected stroke, which deprived me of your excellent mother. I have only written relatives in England and Anna Spooner, whom the dear departed considered as her child." So Abigail Howard is friends with Hannah Bulfinch, is at the end of her life. Anna's father is dead. Andrew also dies in 1802. Andrew father, not Andrew's son. And it looks as if Abigail Howard is making certain that her step-grandchildren are going to still have family to grow up with, which tells us a lot about the kind of person that Abigail Howard was. So, one of my great challenges of studying the Howards is Martin and Annie flee for their lives twice. Abigail does it once. These are not people who left much in the way of a paper trail, except the end of Abigail's life is jam-packed full of paper trails. This is something I've only just started working on in the last 6 months, so I have a lot more to learn. Abigail is living with her parents, Mary and Stephen Greenleaf, on Tremont Street. Her father dies in 1795. He leaves her some money. She goes out and buys herself a house. And her new house is in the first planned urban development in the United States, although people in New York would say that they did that first. It was called Franklin Place. It was designed by Charles Bulfinch, and as you already know, Bulfinch is part of this picture. And it was loosely modeled on similar buildings of this kind in Britain and Europe at this period. If you've ever been to Bath and seen the really famous Bath Crescents, this is what they're going for. And it was intended to be this perfect blend of urban and rural living, because you have the half curve here. They're houses of various sizes. There are basically the equivalent of a 1-bedroom house here, for Abigail, someone like Abigail, but then there's a 3-bedroom over here for someone who wants to build up a family. There are gardens here. And it was also intended to be a place filled with activities for people who live there. This is a painting of it in the early 19th century. Unfortunately for Charles Bulfinch, Franklin Place seems to have been a little too before its time. It'll run into financial difficulties very early on, and it eventually was demolished in 1858. But if you've ever walked up Franklin Street, which is basically around the corner from where we are right now, and notice there's a bit of a curve, that curve is the original curve. So they tore down the buildings, but they kept the shape of the street. And as I mentioned, the inhabitants of Franklin Place were supposed to have the perfect world. Benefits of rural living, parks, this is one of the first garden squares here in Boston, but also the benefits of urban living, culture, discussion. These are 2 paintings done by Henry Sargent in the early 1820s. This is the dinner party here, the tea party over here. They're on display at the Museum of Fine Art. They are both paintings that he painted at his house, which is on Franklin Place, and they give us a bit of a window into the activities of the people there. This, of course, is a couple decades after Abigail's time, but it does still give a sense of all the people gathered around. And as part of this, there was a library. And I will come back to this slide, but if you look there in the center, there's that archway, there was a courtyard there. The library was directly above that arch, and here you can see the gardens right here. So it really is the center of this community. And one of the things we know about Abigail is that she was one of the founders of this particular library, and she was one of 6 women who helped found this library. To briefly go back to her will is, I give this to this woman, I give this to this woman, I give this to this woman. It's clear that this is a woman who knows what it is to be female and alone, who is building these networks and cementing these networks. And we also know from these bits and pieces of things that she, like Martin Howard, firmly believed in supporting libraries and the role that they play in the community. A History of the Boston Episcopal Charitable Society, which was published in 1840, described her as, quote, fond of reading and of a literary turn of mind. And when she dies in 1802, she left all my books, excepting the volumes bequeathed to Andrew Spooner. She leaves a couple of books to Andrew Spooner with a note saying these belong to your grandfather, provided the trustees of the library will allow my aunt, Mrs. Hannah Richards, the use of such as she shall wish to read at any time during her natural life. And that I found a really interesting remark. Like the Redwood Library, this is a subscription library. To read its books, you have to pay the fee. And I think what she's saying here is, my aunt has been borrowing books from me. She's going to go on borrowing books from me. So this bequest points to this important connection between Martin and Abigail Howard. They're both involved in the early stages of creating libraries in their hometowns. And it seems likely that at least some of the books given in this bequest originally belonged to Martin Howard and were brought to Boston with Abigail when she returns in 1783. And as my own grandmother said to me at the end of her life, there is no immortality like a book, which is what she told me when I told her that the book was going to be dedicated to her and my grandfather. Many of Abigail Howard's neighbors in Boston would have considered her husband a disgraced Loyalist at best. James Otis infamously described the Newport Junto as a little, dirty, drinking, drabbing, contaminated knot of beggars and transports. So Abigail's bequest to the Boston Library Society provided a living memorial to the Howards' marriage and their shared love of reading, while also giving her husband the final word any time one of their books was read in Boston. Thank you. And I'm happy to answer questions. Yes?
Might be sort of an obvious question. When did the library come down? What happened to its collection?
The Boston Library Society eventually merged with the Boston Athenaeum. On my list of things to do, because I only just realized Abigail and libraries this fall, so this is very recent knowledge for me. On my list of things to do is to contact the Boston Athenaeum and try and track down their books. I hope they're still there. It would make sense that it would make sense that they're still there. But whether or not I can identify them as their books remains to be seen, because I don't know any of the titles. Yeah.
So the 700 books that were purchased for the first library.
Yes.
Is it possible to summarize the types of books they were?
They are.
This
yeah.
was the first library available in the area.
They are a wide range of topics. There's a little literature, but not too much. This is a period where reading novels is still thought to be bad for you. There are books on history, there are books on law, there are books on science. The idea was a wide range of topics. And there is actually a published catalog of all of them. So we do know exactly what the original collection was. Any other questions?
Were libraries ever like gender segregated for like topics or anything like that? Or?
That's a great question. Couple of answers to that. One, they are one of the first social spaces that women are allowed to inhabit, which I think is why you have these 6 women founding the Boston Library Society, although the Redwood Library seems in its early years to have been a very boys-only place. What I've found in reading about libraries in the 18th century is that they are spaces where men and women can be together, but it was also very common to have women-only lending hours, so a little bit of both. But yeah, they are some of the first spaces where it was acceptable for men and women to sit down and go to a program together. So that in itself was revolutionary in its day.
Do you think it was just a coincidence or just by chance that he went to North Carolina? Or I know that when I was in Newport recently, I saw that once Newport became primarily a tourist destination, that it was the people from the Carolinas specifically who came up for for the cooler weather. Were there already deep ties between Rhode Island and North Carolina at this early era?
Couple of answers. I'm a historian, there's no one answer to anything. Couple answers to that. One, he's made the Chief Justice of North Carolina because there's an opening in North Carolina at the right time. But 2 things, and I am writing a book that is half about Rhode Island and half about North Carolina, so I think about that a lot. There actually does seem to have been a lot of going back and forth between Rhode Island and North Carolina. Harding Jones leaves North Carolina to go to Yale. And I haven't been able to figure out, okay, why are you going to Yale and not William and Mary, which would have been a lot closer. So there does appear to have been some backing and forthing. 2 other things on those 2 colonies in relation to each other. They're very similar in a lot of ways. They are satellite colonies. Rhode Island is always getting eclipsed by Massachusetts and Connecticut. North Carolina is always getting eclipsed by Virginia and South Carolina. They're both that sort of second-tier colony. They're both colonies which have extremely early activity in the American Revolution, which nobody thinks about because they're so busy thinking about Virginia and Massachusetts. And a large part of this book I'm working on is looking at the connections between these 2 and jumping forward if you're at all familiar with the ratifying of the Constitution in the late 1780s, the last two states to ratify it are North Carolina and Rhode Island. Both of them were wildly opposed to federal governments. So there are similarities in culture, in personality, but I also keep finding people who go back and forth between the two of them. So yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the social reintegration of the Loyalists into the new states? Because this is something I knew nothing about. Because where I come from in Vermont, they were all chased out, their land was taken, and they did not come back.
Yeah, that's a great question. That is not my immediate area of expertise because I work on the period predominantly before the war. However, that is one of the most active areas of Loyalist scholarship right now. And Brendan McConville, who's a professor of 18th century history at Boston University, has actually had multiple graduate students working on that topic. One of them just published a book on reintegration of Loyalists into South Carolina after the war. I can't remember her name or its name. He currently is one who's working on integration of Loyalists back into Boston, which of course Abigail and Annie are part of. In a nutshell, there's that period where you need to be gone and you need to be gone now. However, the current research that's being done, I mean, literally in the last 4 or 5 years, has raised the question, at least here in Massachusetts. If you think about where Massachusetts is in the 1780s, Shays' Rebellion is going on. And there are these concerns. We've got all these upstart wild people out in the West. Loyalists suddenly look like nice, sane, stable people. So Christina Carrick at BU, that's the grad student currently working there. One of her arguments is they're actually trying to get the Loyalists back to get everybody to calm down. So stay tuned. This is a topic that we're going to know a whole lot more about in 5 years. You're welcome. Yeah.
Did Abigail have any connections after she returned from England back to Newport?
Well, Abigail never had a connection with Newport because she never lives there. Because she may have never even gone there. I don't know. However, she does maintain at least one connection to North Carolina. There, James Ardell, once again, in the early 1790s, because he of course becomes a justice for the Supreme Court, is in Boston on official business, and he sends his wife a letter saying, I have not yet visited Madam Howard, which becomes Abigail's nickname here in Boston, but I plan to do so shortly. And this is a letter written in the early 1790s when the Howards have been gone from North Carolina for a couple of decades. So the friendship between the Ardell and Howard families continues long after Martin's death, long after their departure. And Annie definitely seems to have tried to maintain some connections with Newport. My guess is that would have expanded if she had lived longer.
Do you know the names of the other 5 women who founded the library with her?
I do. I cannot remember that off the top of my head, but there is a book on the Boston Library Society, which is where I found their names. And that was published, I believe, in 2003. Well, thank you all for coming.
You.